name is Colin Speakerman. I live in Yorkshire and I'm a writer. I want to share with you the remarkable story of Yorkshire, the region of 5.4 million people between the Pennines and the North Sea, the Humber and the Tees. It's a very special part of England, and one which all of us who live in Yorkshire are very proud of. We're proud of our wonderful landscape, our shared rich cultural heritage as a people, and our language, our dialect, which is as much part of our history as the Dales, the Moors, the coast, the Wolds, the Pennines, or the great cities of York, Leeds, Bradford, Sheffield and Hull. Our story starts just over 1,600 years ago in 410 AD, when the Roman army finally left their colony of Britain, or Britannia, to defend their homeland in Rome against invading tribes of barbarians from the north. They left behind a vulnerable Romano-British population, mainly Celtic peoples, who for some years continued their Romano-British ways of living. But it was soon to come to an end during the 5th century, as successive invaders came from the continent across the North Sea, mainly from Northern Europe, from the lands we now know as Germany and Denmark. The Saxons from what is now Saxony in North Germany, the Jutes probably from Jutland in Denmark, the Angles also from Denmark, and the borderland between what is now Denmark and Germany, known as Schleswig-Holstein. The Jutes settled in Kent, the Saxons in the south and west in what became Wessex, and in much of the Midlands in what became the great kingdom of Mercia. The Angles came in great numbers to the east of England, including that part of England to this day known as East Anglia. They also settled further north, initially between the Humber and the Tees in what became known as Yorkshire eventually, but in the 6th century was called Deira or Deira, whilst north of the Tees lay Bernicia. By the 7th century, Deira and Bernicia combined to a great single kingdom, Northumbria, whose capital was the former Roman city and garrison of Eboracum, we now know as York, renamed as Yorkfuik, Wick meaning a market or trading centre, by the Anglians. It was these Anglians who were later to give their name to the whole country, England, or the land of the Angles. The Celtic people were pushed steadily westward into now what is Cumbria, Wales and Cornwall. Some of the ancient kingdoms, such as Craven in what is now the western side of Yorkshire and Elmet in the lower Aire Valley, now dominated by Leeds, remained for a time, only gradually being integrated with the larger number of incomers through settlements and intermarriage. Northumbria was just one of several kingdoms that made up England, all of whose population spoke different varieties or dialects of Old English, derivations of the West Germanic or Teutonic languages of their forefathers, which over the centuries developed into dialects very different in sound and intonation. People from Wessex or Sussex in the south would have had barely been able to understand those of Northumbria or Yorkshire. Smaller kingdoms from the time of King Alfred of Wessex onwards combined as the concept of an English nation came into existence. However, friction still existed between the predominantly Saxon south and west and those of the north and east, dominated by Danish settlers within what became known as Danelaw. The Scandinavian influence increased massively in 865 when a huge Viking heathen army, mainly from Denmark but also from Norway, invaded and after burning, looting and raping, eventually settled in the northeastern part of England, travelling in their shallow longboats up the Humber and Ouse. They soon established their own powerful independent kingdom of Jorvik, based on the inland port of Jorvik or York, which became their major trading and cultural centre. The Viking invaders spoke another variety of Germanic, North Germanic or Old Norse, ancestor of our modern Scandinavian languages. Once Viking settlers had spent decades living, trading and intermarrying with the Anglian population, they spoke a distinctive dialect of Old English which contained many Old Norse words and phrases. But one reason why English rather than Old Norse became dominant even in Yorkshire was that the Vikings had a primary oral culture, writing only in runes, unlike the more literate and Christian Saxon and Anglian monks and scholars who could write fluently in both English and Latin using modern Roman or Latin script. But it was the Vikings who divided their kingdom of Jorvik into thirds or thriddings, which later became known as the East, West and North Ridings, the three ancient counties of the province, which by the 1060s became as known as Yorkshire, shire meaning a division of England belonging to Jorvik or York. After the assassination of the last Viking king of Jorvik, Eric Bloodaxe, in 954, Jorvik became absorbed into Northumbria and England, its king replaced by an earl loyal to the English throne. But the Scandinavian influence didn't end there. Between 1016 and 35, Yorkshire and England once again had a Danish king during the reign of Canute the Great, first proclaimed King of England as a teenage prince in Viking York. Canute for a time reigned over what is now known as the North Sea Empire, which included both Denmark and Norway. Canute's lack of viable heirs, however, meant a return of the Saxon kings from Wessex. The last of these, Harold Godwinson, after defeating an invading Viking army led by Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire in 1066, was in turn defeated and killed by William the Conqueror at Hastings. The Norman conquest was a disaster for the English, but most especially for Yorkshire. William's brutal military dictatorship, built on securing dominance by constructing a series of impregnable stone castles, divided up the land to his thuggish henchmen. This turned England for more than 200 years into little more than a French colony. The occupiers brutally suppressed any opposition, most notoriously in the mass genocide known as the Harrying of the North in 1068 and 69. For the next 3 centuries, Norman French was the language of kings, their courtiers, the barons, the law. English became the language of the common peasants and the dispossessed. Only gradually did a form of English or Anglo-Norman, heavily influenced by French, come to be used in official circles by kings, their courtiers, the landowning barons and their officers and servants. It was not until the time of Geoffrey Chaucer in the 14th century, England's first great poet, did a form of medieval English come to be used in literary and polite circles, even then with a strong French content. This version, initially used by the prosperous wool merchants of the East Midlands who traded in London, was increasingly spoken by the upper and middle classes in the key areas of government, law and scholarship, the London, Oxford, Cambridge triangle, including the areas we still call the home counties. Gradually, over the centuries, it was this East Midland dialect of medieval English, written and spoken, that developed into modern English, now the most widespread spoken language on planet Earth, and most used for trade and international communication. But that isn't the whole story. Right up to the present time, the ordinary people, the peasants, the farmers, the fishermen, the labourers, and in later years the lead and coal miners, the workers in the textile and steel mills, the factory hands and dockers, continue to speak their own local variety of English. So Yorkshire dialect has inevitably been long associated with working class speech, with an arrogant assumption that it was therefore slovenly or ignorant. Yet in Yorkshire this includes many of the essential elements of what makes up a distinct language. Different pronunciations, words and vocabulary, utilising many words and phrases going back to both Anglian and Viking times. Different grammatical structures. For example, including the retention of the thee and thou, second person singular, form, now extinct in modern English except for Shakespeare and the King James version of the Bible. People in Yorkshire who speak with a strong or broad Yorkshire accent are not speaking incorrect English, but in some ways older and therefore arguably more correct forms of the language than much modified and even sanitised modern English. Dialect has many strong and beautiful words which you can't easily translate into modern English. Words and phrases like, now then, I can't toilet, nithering, backendish, gormless, like about, wick, or even an emphatic word like nowt that don't have any accurate translations. This was something recognised by Yorkshire scholars, poets and writers in the 19th and 20th centuries who collected words and phrases into dialect dictionaries which also recognised subtle but important difference between the languages of the three ridings. Indeed, we now know that Yorkshire dialect spans what many scholars describe as the great English linguistic divide, the great division between the Northumbria-derived forms of dialect in the Old North and East Ridings and the more Midlands and Mercian speech forms in the Old West Riding, south of the River Wharfe. Many 19th century Yorkshire dialect writers and poets were inspired by the great Robert Burns, the romantic poet who turned Scots dialect into a great poetic language. They were able to use their own Yorkshire dialects to great effect in both poetry and prose. Popular journals were published in Yorkshire dialect, filled with stories, anecdotes and poems, often comic, sometimes tragic. The most famous of these publications was written by the celebrated Victorian dialect poet and writer John Hartley of Halifax, who produced the hugely popular Clock Almanac on a regular basis for over 50 years. The Yorkshire Dialect Society was founded in 1897, following the inspirational ideas of Professor Joseph Wright and others. Its annual transactions and summer bulletins have encouraged and developed serious study of Yorkshire dialect and publications of the New Yorkshire writing for over 125 years. Leeds University, with whom the Society has always had close links, also became a national centre for English dialect studies. Professor Harold Orton masterminded the great national surveys of English dialects in the 1950s and 60s, which remain a vitally important record of the dialects that has survived and changed into the 20th century. In the early 21st century, in the age of rapidly changing information technology, social media and mass communication, much of it in American English, the question is often asked, can dialect survive? The answer must surely be our language is part of our culture. Yorkshire is a very special part of England, physically defined by the Pennines to the west, the North Sea to the east, the Tees to the north, the Humber and its tributaries to the south. Despite centuries of immigration, which have massively enriched this culture, Yorkshire people still have a lot of Scandinavian in their genes and in the ways they still speak. The language survives too in place names in both town and countryside, be it Briggate or Micklegate, or within our villages, in our dales and on our fells, a constant reminder of our linguistic ancestry, intertwined as it is with the landscape we so love and venerate. Over the last 3 years, Leeds University School of English has hosted an important new Dialect and Heritage project, recording how dialect words and their usage have changed since the work by Professor Orton and others in the 1960s. The decline of Yorkshire's textile, mining, steel and engineering industries, and the mechanisation and automation of much farming labouring work have decimated working class communities, and with loss of those industries, many dialect words linked to industrial and agricultural occupations have drifted into oblivion. Talk Yorkshire, however, is a project led by the Yorkshire Dialect Society about finding ways of taking the Yorkshire language out of the museum, out of the closet. We want to see if we can create, for a younger generation, a new pride in the language of their parents and grandparents. Maybe we need to find new ways of encouraging and inspiring people to speak and write the language as a way of being true Yorkshire, by teaching the language in schools, in colleges and adult education classes. This has been achieved with remarkable success in Wales, in parts of Ireland, and even the island of Corsica, whose population is barely 1/15 of that of Yorkshire. In Cornwall, where the last true native speaker reputedly died at the end of the 18th century, there has been a welcome revival of the language, with several thousands of people who are now fluent Cornish speakers. Cornish is now taught in schools in Cornwall. Could this happen in Yorkshire? Given the huge success of the Eisteddfods in Wales, could dialect flourish through being celebrated in both music and song? Is it time for a Yorkshire Eisteddfod? Maybe as part of Yorkshire Day? Even if a new generation of poets don't choose to write fully in dialect, dialect can enrich, deepen their understanding. Dialect is also a living social document, a hidden history built into the words and the phrases which reflect the communities, often in harsh and difficult social conditions. Dialect too was for many writers in Victorian England often the language of protest. The central government appears increasingly out of touch with people living in for what our rulers seem to imagine are the outer limits of their empire, and at a time many Yorkshire people feel we need to take control of our own destiny. Our dialect, our language, our poetry, our song might be a powerful way to communicate new feelings of solidarity and identity. Let's talk Yorkshire.